increase of the government is the actual climate change in the society, if you wish. Like society's global warming is the increase in power of the government. And whereas the anthropogenic nature of the climate change is at the very least very questionable, the anthropogenic character of the increase of power of government is not, definitely, right? Greetings, this is Eugene the Philosopher, the greatest living philosopher after the unfortunate passing of Quentin Robert de Nameland, who has been the greatest living philosopher before me. In this video I wish to talk about government, once again, and as in many previous ones, alright? So, and in particular, I want to make a statement, or at least a claim, that the government has become somewhat of a force of nature. Or as they say in the law, like a force majeure, you know, like the overwhelming force that you can't really deal with, that doesn't really depend on you, right? So it's like an external factor, like really like some sort of force of nature acting upon you, right? Like a volcano eruption or something like that. And to give you a bit more context, because like initially it might sound a bit stupid what I just said, but let me provide you a bit of context so it would make a lot more sense then. So initially, and again, we're operating in some sort of like quasi-historical narrative here, so bear with me, it's a narrative, alright? Humanity viewed nature as sort of chaotic, right? And again, I've told this story many times already. But humanity viewed nature as a bit of a chaos, right? It was filled with like demons and spirits and gods, perhaps. But then as humanity itself risen up in its power, like the impact of humanity on nature has grown, another view has sort of sprung into life, especially with the Industrial Revolution. And this other view of world is that the nature is actually very ordered. It's like a clockwork, you know. It's like we can actually like find some sort of laws that the nature abides to or with. I don't know, like always, right? So in this way we can actually control nature rather than it being something chaotic and external. And vice versa, like, okay, never mind. And so roughly at this time, at the modernity, right, 17th century and later, we've had this, what Bruno Latour calls the separation of like the nature and the society. So in nature, we have laws of nature, right, discovered with newly born science, like in especially like second half of 17th century, which was the time of Newton, like late Galileo. I mean, Galileo died in 1642, I think. By the way, watch my video about Galileo. I'll link it in the description. So nature became this sort of ordered clockwork kind of thing, and society was more of a like, whatever we want with it, we do with it, right? We kind of write our own laws as we wish, right? So we are free individuals with free will and stuff. We derive the laws the way we see fit for us to live together happily ever after, so to speak, right, as a society. So people are free and the nature is bound by its laws. I mean, people are bound by society's laws, but they are essentially made by people themselves, right? We had John Locke with liberalism, etc. Like first democracies are starting to appear. Well, not the first well, you know what I mean. Okay. So supposedly government as part of the societal sector should be under the control of people, right? So like its laws are written by people and for the people, supposedly at least. So why do I call it a force of nature as and I mean nature in this more primordial sense. Nature is something chaotic and external to you, which is not under your control, which actually doesn't abide any laws at all, right? So it's sort of a reverse to a previous step, actually, the nature of the previous step. So I actually don't know what happened, but it might be just an issue of scale. Like the governments used to be very small and very under control because of that, right? There weren't many people actually operating the government, and so it was very transparent and clear what they were doing. And also they haven't had as much resources as they do now, right? The governments of the earliest republics were very weak, and the governments of late monarchies weren't that strong as well. Like a lot of stuff, like how do you say, slid through fingers, or I don't know. You get the idea. It's sipped through the cracks. I don't know the correct expression. So there were a lot of areas which weren't under the control of the government, right? So, but as the government has increased their scale exponentially since then, pretty much, I mean, it started controlling pretty much everything, right? So, yeah. So, in reality, the government is no longer under the control of people, right? So it almost is not under anyone's control at this point. So it is under it is under the influence of some groups of people, some groups of some power structures and stuff. But these groups of interest, they're mostly invisible to the naked eye, so to speak. And I don't mean necessarily like some sort of conspiracy theories. I just mean literally, like whoever like lobbies whatever stuff, we don't really know, because like we're not in the government, so we have no idea what happens there beneath the rug, so to speak, or again, whatever the expression is. So we arrive at this situation where government does something and nobody knows why and how it happens. It just kind of happens on its own, you know? It's just like a perpetually rolling wheel, like on its own. Like just, it goes somewhere, but nobody knows how and why and where, actually, right? So we arrive at this archetype sort of some sort of liberated demon. You know, we've had some little thing that we could control, but once we remove the clamps, the chains, and it's released, it becomes this uncontrollable thing that devours everything, right? Or we open the Pandora's box, if you wish. Or another metaphor is this farmer and the viper fable, you know, where the farmer saves the viper from freezing and the viper actually kills the farmer, right? So something like that, you know. Here I wish to remember, so this is basically the point of this video, right? In a nutshell. I remember the words, and I probably quoted it already, the words of Galkovsky, the Russian philosopher, who talked about like the inherent similarity of utopias and anti-utopias. So his idea was that, and still is, I mean, he's still alive and active, that anti-utopia and utopia are the same thing, but perceived from different points of view. So in utopia, you consider yourself one of the ruling class, right? One of the architects of this system, whatever it is. And in anti-utopia, you consider yourself as ultimately as a slave of this very same system, utopic system, or utopian, I don't know. But essentially it's the same thing, right? So, and he also brings an analogy, even though it's not related, but I'll give it to you anyway, like a body, human body, right? So it is like an organized system, right? And as, let's say, a consciousness that can control a lot, not all, but a lot of aspects of the body, of bodily functions, you are in the utopia, if you're in the point of view of consciousness. But if you're standing on the point of view of one of the organs, let's say, you might consider it an anti-utopia. You're like working as a slave to, you know, perpetrate this cycle of oppression, you know, you're working for the consciousness, but it may not actually be very thankful for you, or at least even recognize what you're doing, right? So you're an anti-utopia. And so if initially the governments could have been perceived as utopian enterprises, let's say, because we could control them, we were the demiurgs, you know, the masters of what was going on, then now it looks more like an anti-utopia because we can't control it anymore, right? It became this sort of chaotic monster. And why do I call it chaotic monster? Well, just look at what governments do. They cause, like, again, inflation, hence poverty, like wars, hence death and famine and whatnot, all kinds of oppressive measures, so they reduce your freedom, significantly lower your welfare, etc., etc. Like, not only welfare in terms of economics, but also, you know, in your cultural, let's put it broadly, sphere of life. Okay, so it's basically what is called externalities, right? But pumped up to 11 or dialed up to 11 or whatever it is. And in case you don't know what externalities is, it's one of the concepts used by statists, that is, the people who advocate for more state control of everything. So they said, okay, free market is bad because it has externalities. You see, you are free to make a deal with somebody, like to engage in some sort of contract voluntarily, okay, but any such contract brings up externalities. So it has an external potential threat to other people, even though they are not directly in this contract, right? So we should regulate, therefore, right? We should regulate free contracts, basically to make them not being free anymore. But the problem is, and I have a video dedicated specifically to that, it's called Amplification of Risk. I'm going to link it as well, where I talk about how government is itself a much more important and larger and dangerous sort of externalities than any private person could ever be hoping for, even. All right. So any action of the government occurs at such a scale that it brings up much more detrimental side effects than any action a single person can do with their voluntary contract with anyone or any other power structure or whatever. So government's actions cause this sort of cascading avalanche domino style of effect throughout the whole of society, right? Potentially even like killing millions of people, not necessarily directly, like if our actions lead to wars or stuff, like just like lowering like increasing the taxes or inflating the money supply, it creates so much side effects throughout the whole economy that you can easily cause like poverty in, let's say, 1 million people annually, and that would cause like at least, I don't know, maybe tens of thousands of deaths or hundreds of thousands. It would increase crime rates. It would do all kinds of stuff like this, right? But people assume that it's fine. I mean, why not? We're doing it with a noble cause or whatever the hell. But yeah, hopefully you get the idea. And nobody is responsible. That's the most beautiful part of it. That's why I'm saying that it is like a force of nature. It's not under the control. Nobody is responsible. Nobody has any authority, basically. Like, even if you are a president or whatever, you say, well, I've been elected, so it's actually the public that wants me to do this, right? Or something to that effect. Even if nobody from the public would actually want to do it. So, yeah. Yeah, and of course there are many other reasons, or actually like made up arguments in favor of increasing the power of governments, like again the climate change. Actually the government itself in a way regulates the climate of the country, right? And like through that, even by minuscule steps, it can actually impact the whatever outcomes the society ends up with in a major way, right? Force majeure type of way. In a very bad way as well, right? So, yeah, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem, right? As Ronald Reagan said in his inaugural address in 1981, right? I'm not a fan of Reagan, but I mean, this quote is really, really, it's kind of the idea of this video, really, in a nutshell. But I'm not just talking about the problem. I'm actually emphasizing the proximity in cultural sense of this sort of problem to a nature, right? Actually, climate change is a good analogy. Like, increase of the government is the actual climate change in the society, if you wish. Like society's global warming is the increase in power of the government, and whereas the anthropogenic nature of the climate change is at the very least very questionable, the anthropogenic character of the increase of power of government is not, definitely, right? Even though, I mean, technically, even though actually the point of this video is that it is not anthropogenic. I mean, it kind of, it's so out of control right now that it happens on its own, basically. Okay. And, well, some people argue in favor of governments in terms of, like, who's gonna provide security for you, you know, safety, the police and stuff, if you get rid of the government. And in this respect, I see absolutely no difference between, and I think we've had this discussion before, but between the governments and insurance companies. There is one big difference, is that insurance companies are competitive, so there may be many of them operating in the same area or whatever, providing the same services essentially, and therefore, since there is a competition, the quality of services is like exponentially higher than the quality of the services that the governments are providing, right? So in 1849, the Belgian thinker Gustavo de Molinari has written an essay called Production of Security. Again, I'll link it in the description, where he basically argued completely correctly, but still he was one of the first, if not the first, who argued for that the private sector can perfectly well provide security and safety, right? So, yeah. So basically the only difference between, let's say, just as an example, an insurance company and the government is that the government actually doesn't care whether you die or not or get injured or not, whereas insurance company actually cares a lot. So let's say insurance company would never ban possession of firearms because, well, it keeps you safer, right? At least as all the statistics is showing. Whereas the government, it doesn't care whether you live or die, so it might ban the firearms, especially if the government is not interested in you potentially removing itself, i.e. the government, from power, right? Obviously, if you were armless, armless, weaponless, I don't know, whatever, you cannot threaten the government as much as if you have a rifle, let's say, at home, and there's like 100,000 of people like you. So the government is very interested, and there's a good correlation, like any sort of like authoritarian, totalitarian regime, when it comes to power, one of the first things it does is disarms people, right? I can give you many examples of that, like literally dozens. Like including Soviet Union, Nazi Germany, China, and many other places like that. Yeah. All right. So hopefully you got the idea. All right. It was a little bit chaotic as usual, but still, the main purpose of this video is to acknowledge the fact that government has become a problem, an external factor which has gotten out of control. It became a natural disaster, if you wish, or at least a raw, unbridled force of nature. And there seems to be no way back. Like, there seems to be no way to dial the government's ambitions and powers back down, right? With regards to what I've said in some of the previous videos, there may be a next stage. Like, I've proclaimed many times that the national states are over, and I still maintain this point. And I think the next stage would be not the world government still, but it's going to be civilization states. So a much larger states. So in this respect, we may have brief periods of freedom, like during this transition, right? Or when these younger civilization states would be established, like, let's say, roughly speaking, EU, roughly speaking, China, roughly speaking, India, roughly speaking, USA, Canada, and Mexico, things like that. This is what I call civilization states. And when they would become, or would start to become established, I don't know, would start appearing, there might be a brief period when actually you know, there will be a competition between the dying national state powers and the nascent supranational powers, right? Civilization state powers. So in this sort of trench or whatever, the crack, maybe a little bit of freedom would surface, but probably not a lot, right? And the next step, like maybe 100 years after the civilization states, we'll have the global concentration camp finally, right? As the socialists want. Okay. So yeah, the government has become a force of nature. It is sort of this brainless grinding machine almost, right? Brainless, destructive, and overall detrimental to your way of life, everyone's way of life, really. And again, since the government is the force of nature, is a natural disaster in itself, you should try to protect yourself from it, right? Just like you protect yourself from the sun, the rain, the cold, and the elements in general, all right? Okay, thank you for watching. The eons are closing.